You gonna educate me today?
Probably not.
No, probably so. I
I
don't
mean,
know a ton. I don't know a ton of this.
well, we'll see where it goes. I mean,
Okay.
I'm always the military history side of things is where I've always so when I started or when I was in college, I picked history, and just kind of picked it. It was the only thing I was remotely interested in. And I had to do a book report. It was my junior year, I think, and it was a class called America in the '60s. And I picked a book called Marine Sniper by Charles Henderson, and that started my path onto military. So when I was growing up, I always wanted to be in the military. So that was
Yeah.
like that's actually what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And uh, I still remember I was about 12 years old. We were at Cades Cove up in Gatlinburg,
Yeah.
and we were pulled off on one of the little deals, and a guy comes marching by, fully rucked up, right?
Yeah.
And I asked my dad, I was like, Dad, what's he doing? And he said, well, I would imagine he's on leave and he's just training while he's on leave and vacation. Because, Cades Cove's like a what 12-mile loop or something like that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he was walking the whole thing. So we got in the car and we passed him. We ended up, and well, here he comes back by again, and I ended up like we talked to him, and he had a ranger patch on his shoulder, and I was like, well, what does that mean? And he was like, well, I'm a ranger. That's kind of what I do. Blah blah blah. Well, from that point on, I wanted to be a ranger. And so that's the only thing I had given thought to doing is the military. And when I graduated, I had few people recruiting me, not much. And UAB asked me to walk on, and my dad said, "Well, look, give it a try. If you don't like it, drop out and enlist."
Yeah.
Well, the football thing worked out. I wouldn't have gone to college. Like, there's no way I would
Yeah.
have. That wasn't me. So the football thing kind of worked out, but my plan even then was when I graduated, uh, I was gonna enlist, and then maybe after a couple of years get into OCS and still wanted to be a ranger, because I had a
Yeah.
college degree at that point, and well, a GA spot just opened up. Watson Brown asked me, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And coaching's the only other thing I ever gave thought to. Um, and my dad, 5 years later, gave me the same advice. He was like, "Well, try it. If you don't like it, then enlist." And so here I am. But that one book and that class kind of started me on. Like I've read, I don't know, over 1,000 books. I would imagine just on
Jeez.
every. I read a lot, like a
Yeah.
lot. I don't go to bed at night without reading. So anyway,
Well, that's a good thing to do. It beats watching the news.
yeah, I'm not. I watch a little YouTube, mostly car fix it shows, but that's about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Watch a
That's
little.
kind. That's how I am. If I'm working on this stuff or preparing for a game Friday or something like that, I've got some old show or something on YouTube playing. I'll have a lot more playing now since the Braves are put out of the playoffs, so I have no
I'm sure
reason to
you're
turn
sad
on.
about that. I'm not a big baseball guy, but I know people are in the dumps right now about that.
We're going through it. Me and Kyle went to the doubleheader Monday, and that was we both were trying to rack our brains. I think that was the first time both of us have been to an MLB doubleheader, and with what was on the line that day, they needed to split or they needed to just win one game to get in the playoffs. And they lose game one the way they did. I think with the amount of stress and then it just being a doubleheader, I felt like I was in that stadium for 24 hours. It was such a long day. But
I'd much rather watch softball than baseball.
yeah, no, I get it. I get it. It's an exciting sport.
And I played baseball. I played in high school and all that. I can't stand to watch it. So
There's a different excitement level there in softball for sure.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
faster.
Yeah, so was it at UAB then that you had that class you were talking about in that book and all that?
Yep. Yeah,
How long ago was that?
1998.
Okay, not too far. So were you big into history at all before that? Or was that literally like a it clicked moment?
Well, when I started, so when I was in school, you had to, I probably went 2 years without picking a major. And I had one professor, I had to take a history class, and it was kind of like a general U.S. history,
Uh-huh.
early history class. And the professor, who's actually British, funny enough, but he was unbelievable. He's the best teacher I'd ever had. He was awesome. Like he made, even if you didn't like what you were doing, he was a good enough teacher to engage you. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And I think that's where I kind of started saying, well, maybe the history thing, uh, now, history was no joke. Now, I had to write a lot of papers and stuff. It
Yeah.
sucked. But that America in the 60s where I found that book. And then from there, it just kind of, I just caught fire and started reading. I started finding, and where I started, because that book is set in Vietnam, I read everything Vietnam I could get my hands on. And I
Jesus.
started gravitating a lot towards special operations kind of stuff, read a lot about the SEALs. And by that time, there was a lot of books out. The SEALs didn't get popular until, bin Laden,
Yeah.
they exploded onto the scene at that point. But I mean, the SEALs, they actually go all the way back to the UDTs in World War II. You know,
Yeah.
they were blowing up uh, obstacles and stuff at Normandy, and that
Yeah.
was the underwater demolition teams, and that's kind of that spun off. That was the start of the SEALs. So a guy named Draper Kaufman actually started the UDTs in Fort Pierce, Florida. And the infamous Hell Week and the SEALs actually started with Draper Kaufman in 1941, 40-ish, maybe, probably 40. They did a week of just hell training where they didn't sleep, and then that just kind of kept on going. And then by the time the SEALs actually weren't commissioned until 1962, I think Kennedy commissioned the SEALs at that point.
Mm.
And then they started, the Vietnam was their first real where they cut their teeth,
Yeah.
and started doing all that. And then, I think in 1986 or so, SEAL Team 6 was formed as a counterterrorism, unit and all that. So I started in the Vietnam, and then since then I've kind of branched off into about every era. I'm not real strong on the Revolutionary War, and I'm not real strong on World War One. But other than
Mm.
that, the Civil War, the World War II, Vietnam, even all the way up
Yeah.
into the Middle East up till now. I've read quite a bit about it.
Jeez. 1,000 books.
And I don't
That.
know, I guess. I mean, I read a lot. Like I read,
Yeah.
I wear out the library. The library knows
Yeah.
me.
That's
And
good. That's a
I
good
used
thing.
to buy books. I used to buy books. And
Yeah.
actually, one time when we moved, my wife made me get rid of books because I just had, stacks and stacks of books.
Yeah. Well, it ends up your most boxes to move and your heaviest boxes to move.
No question. I got rid of a lot of stuff. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I mentioned to you the other night, there's not a lot to talk about after a 59-7 win, so we talked history. I still haven't finished. It's sitting right over here, but I've got to finish that George Washington book soon. Um, it's just kind of a general, like, it's not a bio, like it's just kind of this guy follows his footsteps, kind of during Revolutionary War times and thereafter becoming president and all of that. And he kind of does like some history on it, and then kind of some modern day stuff, kind of travelogue kind of thing, because that's some of the stuff I want to write eventually. So, and I'm trying to get that author on the podcast too to talk about it. Book's maybe a couple of years old, so I'll see if I can get him on. But so, what's your looking at military tactic. That's what you said. You told me was kind of the your bread and butter, right? That you really like.
Yeah, I mean, I like to study. Well, I like leadership, number one,
Sure.
of all sorts.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really good and a lot of really bad leadership that has happened over time in the military, and so that's kind of I like that. I like reading about different things, the tactics people have used and how they've evolved, and those kind of things. Kind of like World War One. I don't know a lot about it, but I do know the tactics used in World War One were so outdated. It was actually more geared toward the Civil War, all right,
Yeah.
but the weaponry had advanced so far. And if you look at World War One, just absolute atrocity as far as how many people died. And it's
Yeah.
because the tactics hadn't caught up with the weaponry. When you start talking about using howitzers, but you're sitting in, trenches, that's why there was so much, shell shock and all those kind of things started coming to the forefront. Well, their tactics hadn't, in World War One, it's nothing. You could stay in a trench 20 yards away from the Americans could be 20 yards away from the Germans, and you wouldn't move for a month. You
Right.
couldn't gain you gain no yards. Like
Yeah.
nothing. You couldn't gain anything. Yet you're just being shelled and shelled and shelled from miles and miles away, right? So there's
Yeah.
still the tactics were outdated, and so stuff like that interests me.
Yeah. Who are the best leaders that you've read about?
Oh man, that's hard. We've kind of talked about the Civil War. Grant was awesome, but Grant basically just waged a war of attrition. He had the industrial power of the North behind him, and he did some really good things, but he also screwed up some. In a lot of generals, you'll see as their career goes, they do a better and better job. When Grant actually got caught with his pants down at Shiloh,
Mhm.
actually wasn't there and wasn't
Yeah.
expecting to be attacked, and it was iffy on being driven into the river. But then he kind of turned it around, and he had earned the nickname unconditional U.S.
Yeah.
unconditional surrender at Fort Donelson prior to that. But he almost screwed that up, and then as he went, he got better and better. The thing about Grant was he was such a good organizational. He's a quartermaster. That was so
Mhm.
organizationally, he was really, really good. And he understood by the time he got to the West, he left, or to the East, he left the Mississippi after the siege of Vicksburg, and he ended up in Chattanooga. And of course, he captured Chattanooga there. And then later on that spring, he was named, whatever they named him, Lieutenant General or Supreme Commander, as Eisenhower was, or whatever. And he ended up in the East. But by the time he got to the East, he had already started understanding at Chattanooga that he could out attrition the South. He knew that. And so that's kind of where he started. And by the time he got to Virginia, he had more people, he had more men, and he had more guns, and he had more shoes, and he had more food, and he knew that. And so he just slowly, methodically just took it. He didn't do a great job in the wilderness when he was up there, but he just had more people, he had more guns, and he just kept on pressing and kept on pressing. And finally it kind of caught up. He pinned, Lee not being able to maneuver, which was that was his bread and butter was to
Right.
maneuver. And he just
Yeah.
kind of, outmaneuvered that. Another one in the Civil War, which the one I brought up to you is Stonewall.
Yeah.
I think Stonewall's freaking awesome, man. Like, if you study him, and again, I'll say this, Stonewall kind of screwed up early in his career as well. When, Lee had taken over, and it was like June of 1862. Lee had been chomping at the bit at getting in the field. He was
Yeah.
kept in Richmond as an advisor, and finally, they named him general, and he went out in the field, and he broke out of Richmond because they were trying to siege Richmond at that point.
Yeah.
And that's where uh, Lee took over and the 7 Days Wars happened. Well, during that, um, Stonewall actually, he was a little late. He was supposed to flank and come around, and it took him forever to do it. Weather and roads is always a big deal in the Civil War, and he was kind of late getting there. Lee was a little perturbed with him, but Lee was also a pretty patient man.
Mm.
And then after that, Stonewall went on a run. Um,
Yeah.
he was just successful and successful, and he was hard nosed, but he cared about his men. He would march them 25 miles in a day, and a lot of the South had no shoes. I mean, they
Hmm.
didn't have shoes, and they would march 25 miles in a day. They were starving half the time, yet, he's infamous for wearing his little bitty cap and looking shabby and all that kind of stuff. So him and Lee actually did a great job of leadership in that way, in that they didn't stay in, a lot of Union generals would stay in these mansions they would take over or whatever. Lee, his entire career slept in a tent, and so
Yeah.
did Stonewall. So the men loved him for it, and would do anything for him. So
Wow.
um,
Is Stonewall the greatest nickname of all time?
it's pretty cool, isn't it? You know how he got
Like,
it?
well, wasn't it like he just stood? I forget where.
So
It
it was
was
the first Battle of Bull Run at Manassas,
okay. Yeah.
and things were iffy, and the Union had broken a gap into the lines of the Confederates, and he filled his divisions in the gap. And there were actually they had some of the Confederates had pushed out into an open field, and they just started getting
Yeah.
destroyed by cannon fire and all that. So they started retreating, and Stonewall saw it, moved up into the gap, and those guys were actually running through his lines. I mean, just full retreat, turn tail run. And one guy supposedly turned around and said, "Look, there goes Jackson standing like a stone wall." And
Yeah.
then that's where he got the nickname. It just became Stonewall. So
That's just I don't know. That's one of the coolest nicknames I've ever heard. Whether it be history, war, sports, it doesn't matter. That as the kids say, that goes hard. That's
yeah, it's
awesome.
it's awesome. And then right after that, that's where he was in the Valley, and that's where he
You
really
know,
came to fame.
don't
Uh,
Shenandoah Valley or
Yeah, he was in the Shenandoah, and he was outnumbered 3-1. He only had between 15 and 20,000, men, and Bell and some of them guys had 60,000, and he would just outmaneuver them. He just outmaneuvered them all the time. They became the foot soldiers. That was their thing. They would march
yeah,
20, 25 miles in a day. So it was almost like he got known right in the valley as a flanker. He would never be where you thought he would be, or he would just show up in places because he would get up at 2 in the morning and start marching, and then all of a sudden he's not where you think he is, and now he's attacking your flank, and so that's he held off 3-1 odds in the valley and kept the Union from being able to siege Richmond and get to Richmond. So that
wow,
it was a huge deal of what he did up there with as few men as he had. They were not able, they wanted to, their mission, the Union right there was trying to get to Richmond. They thought if they captured
yeah,
Richmond, they could end it. And he kept them from doing that. He just frustrated the crap out of them, and they couldn't get there. So it's a pretty
man.
cool deal.
Have you been to some of these places, like these different Civil War sites you can go
I have
to?
not. I'm the only one in my family that would care about that.
Yeah.
I've been to Vicksburg. My kids and my family, we were driving back. We went to Louisiana or something, and we stopped in Vicksburg. And of course, I was nerding out, but my kids were like, "What are we doing?" My wife is patient for a time.
Yep.
But I would love to do it. I would love to go to Virginia and Pennsylvania and kind of do. And I think I'd probably have to do it by myself because I don't, my wife wouldn't be in on it, I don't think.
No, that I hey, you need a a little self-reflection type trip every now and then.
Well, when you go to something like that, like Vicksburg, I kind of had an idea about what had happened there. When
Yeah.
you don't have any idea, it's not really, you're like,
What is
okay,
this?
you're just
Yeah.
looking across this field, and
Yeah.
you're standing at a cannon emplacement. Okay, cool. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
what next? So I think if you know what's going on, it's a little more interesting.
Yeah, you've got to have a little, like at least a little bit of historical perspective. Like that's what I've gotten so much doing that letters project that I did this year from Elias Davis that was from Trussville, and
Yeah.
we've got 90 some odd letters that he wrote home, and the original letters are at I think it's, I forget the name of the library, but at the University of North Carolina. How they ended up at the University of North Carolina, I don't know, but they've got them in their Southern Historical Collection. And Earl Massey, who has since passed, but he went up there in like 2000, and I wish I would have been able to ask him this, but he transcribed all of them so that we would have copies of them here. And I'm like, I I've read what kind of how he described that project of poring over, the cursive and determining what letters were what, and just kind of making sense of the language since it was so different back then. And he said it took months, and I was like, did he just like stay in North Carolina for a couple of months, or did he kind of go back and forth at times? Like, I would love to know that, but we took those letters, and I knew we had them at our museum in Trussville, and I peered at them from time to time. But sometime earlier this year, I was like, okay, I'm gonna retype these, have people read them, kind of nix the run-on sentences, not change the content or anything, but make it easier for someone to read out loud
Right.
and turn it into something. Didn't expect it to be 4.5 hours long, but here we are. And I guess that's a long way of saying, that historical perspective that I at least gained from it. I learned so much from it, just not necessarily tactician wise, but you mentioned the guys being without shoes. There's a lot in there about that. Obviously, a lot in there about what their goals were. A lot of disdain for Abraham Lincoln, since this was coming from a Confederate soldier, and it was cool to take something that's obviously so nationally historic. I mean, the Civil War, and see it through the eyes of someone from where we live. I thought that was just unbelievable.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I mean, it's interesting, anytime you can read something by somebody that I read a lot of books we've talked about war and battle and those kind of things. I'll be honest
Yeah,
with you, I very, very, very seldom ever read anything by a reporter that's been embedded. Okay.
yeah,
There's just too much there can be too much skew politically that way. But
hmm,
when you can read something about somebody who's actually there
yeah,
and and a lot of times those guys like the guy that you did the letters from, he probably didn't have a very big view of what was actually happening in the war and those kind of things, but the
right,
day-to-day acts, the day-to-day of what the soldier was going through
yeah,
is hugely interesting to me.
yeah,
Way more interesting. And I'm not a big political, that's why, that's one thing about, people talk about
yep,
Civil War. Well, the South was wrong. You shouldn't like Stonewall. I don't. I just I'm talking about him
yeah,
as a general. You know what I'm
yeah.
saying? No
Yeah,
different.
and like, I did it because, well, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's history and it happened, and that's always my
Right.
perspective when it comes to history. Whether someone ends up on the right side, the wrong side, I don't care. I just want to learn from it, right? And when you read that kind of first person narrating kind of thing, this is what I've told everybody, having done that project. Slavery, wrong. Okay, like I think we can agree. However, once you read some of this stuff that is, from the horse's mouth, right? I'm not saying it's like this across the board. I'm not trying to overgeneralize, but it's not necessarily at times all black and white. There can be some gray in there. Like, yes, this family had a slave. His name was Prince. And to protect, as I say, I mean, to protect him, this is what I gleaned from it. You know, they were worried with Prince staying back home here where we live and the federals coming down and taking him. Now, apparently, it made it seem like Prince was content with his life. Who knows? But they sent him up with Elias Davis in Virginia so that he could protect him there. Now, did he wash his clothes and carry his bag for him when he got up there? Yeah. But did he also get maybe some protection that he wouldn't have otherwise gotten? He got that too. So like, and I've seen pictures of people, you know, a lot of these slave women kind of raised the families, and it was like the kids almost like doted on them, you know, it was like it was very much like a mother figure. Again, slavery, wrong, but there is some gray in there that not every single story is horrendous.
Well, and even Lee, Lee had slaves as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you read about him, and he wanted to let him go. Of course, people don't really realize this. Lee was broke, like literally broke.
Oh no.
He was saddled with debt.
Oh
Um,
no.
after his dad had passed away and all that. Like literally, when I say had nothing, like he had nothing. Arlington was his estate, but he owed so much money after deaths in the family and all that kind of stuff.
Mm,
And he actually had slaves and ended up freeing them before the end of the war. And he was kind of saddled with that, and he inherited it. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
But and several of the freed slaves went on for the Union to serve in distinction in the
Mm-hmm.
Civil War. Some of them were really, really good. Grant started utilizing them. At first he was a little hands off with it, but then he grasped the concept and started utilizing them, and they served very, very well.
Yeah.
There was upwards of 100,000 free blacks that were fighting for the Union,
Yeah.
and they started, especially when they were in Mississippi, Tennessee, and all that. They would have an influx of slaves coming into their lines, and they had to do
Right.
something with them. And
Yeah.
you could only send them so many places up north. So then they started having the men started forming them into regiments and all that, and they served very, very well. So really,
Yeah. Yeah, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. You mentioned Vicksburg and then talking about like, you know, getting the story straight from the source as opposed to an embedded type reporter type. You know, that comes across in this. It's funny to think about how quickly we get information these days and how much information we get and how slowly things move back then. When Vicksburg happened, he was in he was mostly in Virginia. I think they maybe spent. I mean, I know he was in Pennsylvania, so he was up at Gettysburg, and then I think maybe he touched Maryland, came down to into Georgia, and I think they were going to move them into Tennessee, but stayed in Virginia near Richmond. I think is how his kind of flow happened. And when they started getting word about Vicksburg happening, they didn't believe it. They said they were like, there's absolutely no, like you're punking me basically. And then
well,
it
part
took
of
a
the
couple weeks for them to really like be like, oh, like this actually happened.
Well, and a big reason for that is because things for the Confederates were going much better in Virginia than they were down here. It
Yeah.
was almost like I can't believe it. And people have a hard. You said he was at Gettysburg.
I think he was up there for a quick bit and came
Now
back.
there were elements from Alabama that served in Gettysburg. And people don't realize that. They think if you were in Alabama, you just stayed in the South, and that's not true.
No.
There's if you do a lot of you do background on soldiers from Alabama, they were at Gettysburg, and
Mm-hmm.
which Gettysburg was a whole thing because that's post Stonewall.
Yeah.
That was right after Chancellorsville, where Stonewall got killed.
Yeah.
and Gettysburg was a weird thing in that Lee screwed it up, honestly.
Mm,
He really did. He screwed Gettysburg up. Now it ended up, it was a win for the Union, but it wasn't a destruction of the Confederates, right? So they were able
right.
to retreat south and whatever. But at Gettysburg, Lee really was almost asleep at the wheel. Jeb Stuart had done one of his things where he wanted to ride around the Union Army, which he had done two or three times prior. So basically, Jeb Stuart would circle, and Jeb Stuart was Lee's right hand man in his eyes. Okay,
Mm,
so whatever Jeb Stuart told him, that's what Lee went off of. Well, going up to after Chancellorsville, Jeb Stuart had taken over for Stonewall after Stonewall had gotten killed, and he
mm,
finished that up. Which we talked about this. I think I said it the other day that the South actually may have could have ended the war at Chancellorsville had they had Stonewall had started earlier on his flanking march. I
yeah.
think I told you that it may have been the greatest military maneuver. I don't know. That may be um, what do you say? It may be embellished, but maybe not. The thing about it is, if you don't know anything about it, just imagine Chancellorsville. It's just a little bitty place, and
Mhm.
they called it the wilderness, and it's called the wilderness for a reason. It was just so imagine just thick wood
Yes.
where you can't even get through it. Like
Hmm.
Chinese privet kind of woods. You know what I'm talking
Oh,
about?
yeah, I do.
And so Hooker had taken over. Burnside had been destroyed at Fredericksburg. Stupidly
Yeah.
tried to cross the river at Fredericksburg and just frontal assault and just got mauled. Well, then Burnside gets fired. Hooker takes over. Washington is pressing him to do something, do anything, do something. And they didn't want to attack back at Fredericksburg, and that's where
Right.
the Confederates were. And so he decided to flank them. He went north and west, went over the Rappahannock, came down south. Lee got wind of that. He left Jubal early on the heights at Fredericksburg and then took most of his army and met him in between Chancellorsville, right? Well, as soon as Hooker found out that Lee was coming towards him, instead of attacking, he set up defense in Chancellorsville. And Meade was actually on the River Road. And if Meade would have continued south, they would have captured Fredericksburg and then they could have surrounded the South.
Wow.
And so what happened was Hooker probably nervous because the Union had not had much success up to this point.
Right.
He said, "Hey, we're going all in on Chancellorsville," and he stopped Meade. Meade was coming down. So think about Chancellorsville here. Meade was above and was coming down here along the Rappahannock and was
Yep.
going to Fredericksburg. And the only thing at Fredericksburg for the Confederates was Heth's division. And that's it. That's all that was there. And it was, I'll be honest with you, if you go and read about it, it's really interesting. Heth went to lengths to make them think that there were more people there by they would shoot and then run down a little ways and shoot again and then run down a little so it looked like there was more that's how thin they were at Fredericksburg. Well, he held Meade up and told him don't go any further. We're going to make our defense stand at Chancellorsville. And so at that point they were still outnumbered. The South was
Yeah.
outnumbered big time, like big time. And it's infamous now that at Chancellorsville, Lee and Stonewall sat on some wooden
Mm.
boxes and in the dirt drew up what they were going to do. And Stonewall wanted to flank and go around the right flank of Chancellorsville. And they found a kid, it's 12 years old, a local. And on the maps they had, you got to understand, maps back then were not what they are today. They knew there was a road that went around, but it went real close to what's called the Grove, and that the Union had that area locked down. But they found this kid who was a local kid that owned a, he was his dad owned a farm there, and the kid actually led them on a road that nobody knew about. And it was a 15-mile march, and they flanked all the way around to the right side of Chancellorsville. And interestingly, they actually could see him. And I can't remember who the union it was, but they saw him at the Grove. But what happened is the road looped around and it actually turned south. And so the guy with the union sent word to Hooker, and they confounded this theory that they're retreating. Okay.
Yeah.
So Hooker dismissed it basically. Okay, well, they're retreating. All right. We've kind of won this thing. He was feeling good about himself at that point. And
Yeah.
then, but he also got some reports from people. We see people moving. They're moving out on our right flank here. They're moving. And he just kind of disregarded it. And they finally get there at like three, I don't know, between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. And then they had to kind of, set up because, when you're talking about moving 15 miles with 16,000 people, your lines are strung out all over the place. So he started forming them. And Stonewall saw we got to go. So he didn't even wait on everybody to get up. Now, his plan was actually to leave earlier. And I can't remember what happened, but he actually left late and he didn't get there till then. If he had gotten there a couple of hours prior, what ended up transpiring, he may have crushed him and sent him into the river, and it could have possibly ended the war. So he gets there and he starts forming his lines, and then finally he says, "Go, just go, let's go."
Yeah.
Well, for the Union, they had Howard on their right flank. And funny enough, Hooker had ridden out to Howard's lines and said, "This ain't good. You need to fix this." They were all facing south. And he was like, "You need to turn your flank and be ready from the west, blah, blah, blah." And then he rode off and he never said anything else about it. Well, part of Howard's problem was Howard was not a very well thought of leader. He didn't really do anything, and he also had one of the worst regiments in that he had a lot of, and like it or not, it is what it is. He had a lot of Germans in his thing, and they had been known to run from fights or whatever, and that's who he was in charge of. Well, they didn't like him already. They
Yeah.
had a guy named von something, I can't remember his name, but it was a German in charge of them. They
Right.
sacked him. They put Howard in charge. They didn't like Howard. Howard wasn't really good. And so anyway, here comes Stonewall. And they're literally running. I mean, just running forward. And Howard's guys take off and they actually run through Chancellorsville. They are where Hooker's headquarters is. He took over a house. There are people literally running through there, just running away. Go get away from getting killed. Well, the problem is they started so late it got dark
Yeah.
and they couldn't continue to press the attack, although Stonewall wanted to. But the wilderness being what it was, they couldn't do that safely. So they ended up bedding, they decided to call camp and they were going to resume in the morning. Well, Stonewall goes out that night being who he was. He didn't just send somebody else to look. Their lines were so close. Like when I say close, like 30 yards away, the Union
Yeah.
line was away from the Confederates. He went out on his horse with some of his aides, and one of his generals was there, may have been A.P. Hill, and a North Carolina regiment didn't know. They didn't pass word, and they just heard horses out there and could barely see something. They started shooting. Stonewall gets shot,
Oh
and
man.
so now he goes down. He got shot in the arm. He ended up dying of pneumonia. They kind of got him down, got him through lines, got him out the back, and whatever. But at that point, Jeb Stuart had to take over. They ended up pressing the attack the next day and ended up running the Union back across the river. But if they were able to continue that attack, they may have caused just absolutely catastrophic damage to the Union. So the Union was a little bit lucky in that they were able to get out of that thing.
That's crazy. Well, because then what? A month later, Gettysburg.
Yeah, so right after that, Lee's trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? And Lee was politically connected. He understood the
Yeah.
politics of the whole thing. And he wanted to, and for the second time, he had already been up north. He wanted to go up north and take back because his thoughts were if we can go up there and we can win, then we can show some of the people, especially in Maryland, who were some were sympathizers, some
Yeah.
weren't, that maybe he could get some people to come in and start being with the because up to that point now the Confederates had had their way with the Union. I mean, they
Yeah.
had so things politically were not good in
Mhm.
Washington D.C.
Nice.
So he wanted to go north, and that's what he did. And of course, Gettysburg was right after that. He did not have Stonewall. People wonder if he could have won the war if Stonewall was there. The problem at Gettysburg was Jeb Stuart, like I said, he lost. So Jeb Stuart came up with his idea. They wanted to find the Union Army, and the Union
Yep.
Army was still south, but they didn't know where you got to understand, they didn't have planes and stuff. Now the
No.
Union had hot air balloons, but they couldn't, travel that far and whatever. The South had none of that. So Jeb Stuart was going to circle the Union and come back up north above Gettysburg and come back down and capture some stores, just cause general havoc.
Yeah.
Well, Jeb Stuart just goes AWOL, okay, and he's gone for weeks, and Lee has no idea what's going on. And part of Lee's problem started with he leaned on Jeb Stuart so hard. He still had cavalrymen, but he didn't send them out. He didn't let them go and
Yeah.
do what Jeb Stuart would do and tell him exactly where they were. So the South was actually surprised to learn that the Union had gotten up to the south part of Gettysburg, and the South and the Confederates were north of it. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden they come and tell him, "Hey, we've got people shooting at us, and they have on blue coats. It's not militia. They got on blue coats. They're in Gettysburg." And Lee's like, "What? What?" So he starts moving Longstreet, starts moving some people up. Well, Harry Heth is actually the one besides Jeb Stuart, probably screwed the whole thing up. Lee had standing orders, do not press attack. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Heth started moving up in reconnaissance to find out what was going on. And Heth thought that it was just militia in Gettysburg. And so he started pressing. And then they come to find out, okay, this is not just militia. But by that time, once you get engaged that closely and that heavily, you can't just pull out. You'll get destroyed. They will counterattack and you're done. So he kind
Yeah.
of started having to hold his line, and Lee finds this out. He starts coming up with Longstreet, and
Yep.
he's like, "Okay, we got to go."
Yeah.
Like,
It's on. Yeah.
all right. So he sends Longstreet out to I guess it would be the western flank, and you go up to Missionary Ridge and all that. The Union had the best they ended up falling into the best ground. Gettysburg itself is not great. Now, just south of Gettysburg, you got in on the western side of it, you got Missionary Ridge, and you've heard of
Yeah.
Cripples Hill, and then you've
Yeah.
got Little Round Top and all that. Well, the Confederates actually pushed them into the best area, and Lee,
Hmm.
still foggy, doubles down and attacks this high ground. And of course, Pickett's charge and all that. And he finally realizes we can't win this. And if he would have listened to Longstreet, Longstreet was long. All right. So I always think of it this way: Lee's the head coach, Longstreet's the defensive coordinator,
Yep.
and Stonewall was the offensive coordinator. That was how they
Hmm.
Longstreet really liked to fight defensively. And Lee had been in that way. They called him, what they call him? The King of Spades, because he was always telling them to dig in, okay, dig trenches
Yeah.
and all that. Well, Stonewall was on offense all the time. So he had a really good mixture. As a leader, you need people like that,
Oh
right? On
yeah.
both sides of it. And, once Stonewall goes down, Lee had slowly started becoming more offensive because he knew he was down in men, down in numbers, down industrially, didn't have the arms, didn't have everything. So he started using some of Stonewall's mindset and attacking and going on the offensive. Well, Longstreet had told him the whole time at Gettysburg, stop. We don't need to do this. Stop. Quit.
Yeah.
Let's not do this. This is not good. We don't. And then Lee kept on pressing, kept on pressing, kept on pressing. And then, they ended up kind of getting defeated. If they would have moved, if they would have known, I still think this, if Jeb Stuart had come back, told them where they were, and they had moved faster, they could have got the high ground on Little Round Top and all that. And there's no way that the Union would have beat them off of that ground.
No.
But it was just a matter
Wow.
of the ground. So
I mean, it's fascinating. Like that's something that I want to start learning. Obviously, more of this stuff because I haven't gotten into the weeds yet. Doing that letters project took me like months and months, and it's almost like it's just opened a door for me to want to learn more and read more. But you can kind of see that in those letters. Like if you take them and say, yeah, they're a trustful guy, but you explode that out, what he's talking about to the entirety of the campaign. All these letters are dated with the exception of the first few, which were like context clues from it. It's like summer 1861. It's early. And all throughout 1862, even into almost mid 1863, you get this sense in the way he's writing that it's just complete optimism. We're going to be home before Christmas. This thing's going to be done. We've done this, this, and this. We're whipping the enemy. They've got no shot. And then, kind of late 1863, you start to see that tone really start to change. Like, really start to change. He's a lot more frustrated. They're frustrated with leadership, like regiment leadership, and you can kind of start to see, we can kind of Monday morning quarterback it, and you kind of start to see the writing on the wall, and he
yeah,
starts to see it too. And then ultimately, that guy that I did that letters project on, he dies at I guess it was the second Battle of Weldon Railroad in Virginia in August 1864. I think they were trying to hold off some destroying of that railroad, and
that's right when Grant took over.
yeah,
Like
so
right when Grant took over.
so August 1864. So he caught a bullet there and ended it for him right there.
Well, that's another whole another thing as far as leadership goes in the Civil Wars. There was a lot of bad leadership. It was bad.
Yeah,
It was just not good. And of course, here's the thing. Most of these guys, the generals anyway, had cut their teeth in the Mexican War, and um, so they had battle experience. Lee was there, Grant was there, Stonewall was there. Burnside. All those guys had been in war. But then what happens is you're taking this same team, but then you're dividing up the coaches, right?
yeah,
So you
yeah,
got a coaching staff, and then all of a sudden we're going to do an intra squad scrimmage. And so these coaches go here and these coaches go there, but they could pick and choose which way they went. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
So you end up diluting your quality, I guess, of leadership. And then, for the Union, their first draft pick was Lee. That was their first draft pick. And it came down to him saying that he knew that the war was going to be in Virginia to start, and he couldn't leave his state. That's the reason why he went with the South ultimately. They were, I mean, pressing him. They wanted him to be the guy for the Union.
yeah,
And he was like, I can't do that against the state of Virginia when Virginia ended up being, I think they were the last one to secede. He ended up going with Virginia in the South. And of course, uh, Stonewall was a Virginia guy as well, so it was a deal where you dilute your quality of leadership, but then they all have to be in position, right? And the Union just had a string of just horrible, horrible, horrible leadership. everybody in the Union loved McClellan, but McClellan
Yeah.
sucked.
Yeah.
It wasn't any good. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Then you go, and of course McClellan was in charge when Lee took over, and Lee ended up defeating him in the 7 days. And then I think they went to Pope, and that's when Second Battle of Bull Run happened. Funny enough, that's another place where Stonewall did a great job. He was already set up at Manassas, and he was waiting on the Union, and Pope started attacking him, and Longstreet and Lee had flanked around again, flanking, but they were just they had to maneuver in order to keep up with the Union. So Stonewall just, I mean, he had great ground. He had a big ditch in front of him, and they were just sending waves after wave after him. And he defeated it and defeated it and defeated it. And finally, Longstreet and Lee show up and tie into his right flank. And finally, Longstreet goes on the attack. And by that time, Stonewall was really beat up. Like he beat up now. I mean, he had lost a lot of people, and they started pushing the Union up on top of a ridge, and they wanted Stonewall to counterattack the right flank from where his position was.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, I don't really know exactly why. There was some excuses. He was beat up, but he was just late to do so. That's another time where they already ran him back across the river. They could have destroyed him there as well. They could have destroyed Pope at that point had Stonewall go ahead and came up with him. So then Pope gets sacked after Second Bull Run, and they went back to McClellan.
Ugh.
Well,
So,
McClellan, he goes down, and after Antietam, which was the worst as far as casualties and fatalities and all that,
yeah.
McClellan gets fired again by Lincoln, and I think right after that, that's where Burnside gets it. Burnside just royally screws. Burnside didn't even want it, like he didn't want it, but I think it was Meade, maybe I can't remember. Burnside did not want somebody else to take over, and so he did.
You
And he
did.
even told
Yeah.
Washington, "Hey, I shouldn't be the guy." Well, then, Burnside takes over. He does the infamous Mud March thing, goes back, and then just frontal assaults Fredericksburg. He gets destroyed. Then Hooker takes over. Hooker gets destroyed, and then finally Meade takes over, and that's when Gettysburg happened, and then kind of from there, think good things started kind of happening to the Union or whatever. So
That's man. It's. I don't know. It's crazy thinking about it. Like I don't know. Just the downstream effects of different decisions, and I mean, especially like Stonewall getting shot and killed, and you kind of lose your offensive guy. Like I wonder, you try to play that out in your mind, like if this doesn't happen, how does this thing unfold, and where are we, 10, 15, 50 years down the road?
yeah,
It's a
that's the
crazy
part
game.
that's real. That stuff is like really interesting to me. That and what would have happened if he would have been if what would have happened if he would have left 4 hours prior? You know what
Yeah,
I'm saying? Would he have gotten killed? Right. What if he was at Gettysburg? What if
yeah,
Jeb Stuart hadn't gone AWOL? Um, what if Grant had gotten killed?
yeah,
What then for the Union? Because he ultimately came in and he organized and basically he didn't save the Union. I mean, he kind of did. I mean, he wrapped up the West.
yeah,
Uh, what if he would have attacked South? After Chattanooga, he wanted to go to Mobile, actually.
yeah,
That would have been interesting, as far as our state goes. After after they wanted Chattanooga, his plan, what he wanted to do was go to Mobile. And then basically he closed off that port, for the South. And then he wanted to move from there back up into central Alabama and then move into Georgia. And then Washington was like, no, we need help in Texas. And Grant was like, Texas? Who cares if it's west of the Mississippi? But they ended up not going to Mobile, and of course, he ended up taking over in spring of '64. I guess is when he got named whatever they named him, the lieutenant or the whatever, like kind of
Yeah,
like commander, like Eisenhower was, and he, of course, he went east at that point. So that the North just had such a huge industrial advantage over
yeah,
the South. I think that was really the difference in the war was that, and then population centers
sure.
were so much higher in the North. But the industrialization is what really killed the South as far as that goes. Because
Yeah,
once Grant took over, he was just willing he was willing to lose men and whatever
yeah,
because he knew if he just kept on pressing that at some point the South was they didn't have enough. They just
that's
didn't
it.
have enough. So
He wore him down in the fourth quarter.
yeah, no doubt. I mean, he just kept on pressing. He lost men, didn't do a great job in the wilderness the second time around, but he just kept on pressing. He just smoked his cigars and keep going, boys.
Yeah. Was
Keep
it
going.
was there any like I mean maybe it'll be hard to think of one, but like all the books you've read, like specifically about the Civil War, like that 4 hour whatever gap where Stonewall was late. Like I wonder if anybody's done something like maybe the
There's
whole
a
book
couple of
doesn't.
really good. There's a couple of really good books. Oh, wait a minute. What gap? What are you talking about now?
The one where you said he was not the gap that he filled, but like when you said he was late leaving or
So he was late in the 7 Days War. That was early on. There's some books
yeah.
about that. But the at Second Battle of Bull Run,
Yeah,
there's several books about the Second Battle of Bull Run that kind of talk about it. And I say he was late to what they wanted, what Longstreet wanted. Longstreet And again, here's the thing in that whole situation. Longstreet was tied into Jackson's right flank. And down south, there happened to be a division, and I can't remember who it was. There was a division in the middle of the road, and Longstreet kind of was like trying to feel his way around, and he was not a real offensive guy. Finally, he goes, "Okay, I think we're good." So he started pushing south, and it goes up onto a hill below where they were fighting and back around the top side. That's where Lee was tied in. And so Longstreet started pushing him for here. And if Stonewall would have counterattacked, now they were pressing them from two sides. And so right above that is where the river was. And so
right.
basically Longstreet pushed them off of the hill and they ended up going back across the river. Well, if Stonewall could have counterattacked and kept on coming up this ridge, then they basically would have pinned them and could possibly have destroyed them in total right there. There was a couple of times where both armies could have completely destroyed it and then ended up, like at Gettysburg, right? That the North had lost a lot of people, so had the South, but they let the South escape that as well. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
like they never, and that's what the stuff where your guy was probably frustrated in that. In could this have been over? Could this have been done? You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
But
Well, he
there's a
kept
lot of good books. Stonewall, one of the best books just about Stonewall I read was called Rebel Yell. It kind of details his life and then his whole command. There's a book called Chancellorsville. There's a lot of books about Chancellorsville. That's one of my favorite battles. It's really really interesting to read about. I'm reading one right now about Grant called Grant Takes Command or whatever. So it kind of details him from the South. And then right now, where I'm reading, he's in Chattanooga or whatever, about to take over the whole thing. So,
yeah. Well,
anyway.
no, it's interesting. This is what I've told everybody about. This is my funny story from doing that project. So that project, I mean, you're a UAB guy, so you know Hillman Hospital downtown, right?
Hmm.
You know the big green statue of the guy out front.
Yeah.
So the Civil War guy, Elias Davis, that I did this project on, that statue is his son.
Oh,
So
interesting. Okay.
so I did a project about a year ago on William Davis, so the son who that statue is of. The guy who made that statue also made Vulcan, so there's your trivia fact. So I do that project, and I'm like, I know this last name. I've seen this name somewhere in our museum, so I went hunting around, refound the letters, and I was like, okay, I'm really going to take a deep dive here. And so then I'm putting it together, doing this stuff chronologically, retyping all that. And he's writing like, it was sporadic, but if I averaged it out, he's probably sending his wife a letter every 5 or 6 days. I mean, he'd send one 2 days later. Some it would take 2 weeks just to get another one sent. And so I'm reading this, and he's like, I know I'm going to be home, so we're starting to maybe grant some furloughs here. This is late 1862, and he's things are going well, and he was kind of an upper guy in his division, and so he's like, I'm not taking my leave right now. He's like, I'm going to give it to all my guys, and then I'll go later. He's like, I'll be home sooner rather than later anyway. So he goes home, and well, let me back up. I see a huge gap in the letters, okay, between somewhere in February 1863 and mid-April 1863. No letters for a month and a half. And I'm like, am I missing letters? What's going on? And then it hit me, context clues. I was like, okay, he got his furlough. He went home. That's why there's no letters. And the guy in the statue, his second son, William, was born November 1863.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay.
So I don't know. I always thought that was weird that I was like, okay, so like I did this project on this guy, and then literally found that he definitely got his furlough. He was.
Well, another interesting thing I think of when I'm reading some of this stuff, like you say, he got a furlough. If he was in Virginia, think about how long it takes to get home.
Hmm.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like we just
Yeah.
take it for granted. I drove to
Oh yeah.
Washington D.C. like a year and a half ago or 2 years ago or something. It took 11 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
It's going to take you. It could take you for depending on the rail lines because the rail lines were so eaten up. The
Yeah.
South only had a few that they could supply there. So can I get on this train and make it south? And how do I get home and then getting back? I mean, it could take
Yeah.
forever to do all that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. There was at one point in that. I think it was like right after that. It might have been his. It might have been his first letter that he sent back after that furlough. So we're probably, April 1863. And I know they were, maybe it was in Atlanta, and they were heading back up to Virginia. And he was writing about waiting at a rail line or whatever. And he was talking about like the bottles of whiskey that she sent him, to go back with. And he said, they never made it on the train.
Yeah, no doubt.
I mean,
Uh,
they just there was a different mindset those first 2 years where there was a lot of picket duty, there was a lot of hanging out, there was a lot of he's like he talked about how much weight he was gaining because he was eating all the time and drinking all the
People
time and
they didn't understand or they didn't have any concept. You realize that at the first Manassas, the first Battle of Bull Run, there were spectators there like a football game.
really,
Yes. Like, so people came from Washington, D.C. Now you got to imagine, here's the thing. There are people that come out and stood to watch this, and there are women in dresses and men in suits. It's like they came out like a football game or something. And did
my
this, and
gosh,
then just come, they were
it's like
people were
Gladiator,
horrified. They were horrified at what they saw at
yeah,
the mass deaths and people like you look down and there's just a leg there, right?
yeah,
You got to understand up to this point the only thing that they had coming out of the Revolutionary War, people at that time, that was their big thing, right? So they're thinking Revolutionary War muskets, right?
Yep.
There's a few cannon on ships and then whatever. Well, now you have mobile artillery, okay?
Mhm.
And that wasn't really a thing in the Revolutionary War. And so you've got artillery going off and just exploding, and now you've got rifles that can you're accurate out to 500 yards, right? And there's just people out there spectating, and then from that point on, they realized, okay, this is a little different than what we thought it was going to be, and the attitude changed a little bit about it, but both sides thought it was going to end a lot sooner than it did. They had
Yeah,
no idea that it was going to be a 4 year, almost 5 year ordeal or whatever. So
yeah, yeah. Because that's, I mean, how he would end those letters. I mean, most of them were to his wife, uh, a few to her parents, a few that were really short to his oldest son, who once I went back and retraced him, he was probably 4, 5, 6 years old during the time he was getting these letters. So they were, be good, don't curse. They were really short, just simple kind of stuff. But the way he would end those letters, I mean, you would have, your affectionate husband, see you soon, whatever, that kind of stuff. And then, as that calendar started to flip, especially 1863 to 1864, it became, like, I hope I get to see you again. If I live, that one stands out to me because he wrote about it so like matter of factly, just like if I live, we'll have a good life, And then ultimately, I think his last letter he sent maybe right at a week before he got killed at that siege of Petersburg.
well, some of the again as things started to go, 1862 was that was the year. Like there were major battles, during 1862. So if you live through all of those, say you were at two of them, you know,
Yeah,
you see just mass scale. Like Antietam is the worst, still the worst
yeah,
that's ever happened to our country, right? I mean, you're talking like 20,000 casualties. I mean,
crazy.
just 20,000, casualties. And I think your attitude starts changing, and it's to the fact that, your buddy, up, he's dead, up, he's dead, he's dead. And then there were literal times when the Confederates were starving. They were literally starving. And Virginia was so used up it was just trampled. Like there was
Yeah,
nothing growing there. There was you gotta understand when you're talking about having 150,000 men, just men, then you have all the animals. They say that's a problem. When you got horses that have to have fodder
yeah,
and they have to send them off somewhere during winter, the South would send them further south and into North Carolina and some of that for places for the animals just to survive. There's just no food and the whole land is just desolate and beat down and no grass. That's an interesting thing to read about is guys would talk about uh, early on 1860, 1861, and how lush Virginia was and whatever.
yeah,
And then you get up into 1862 and 3 and 4, and there's no grass. There's nothing
yeah,
living. There's not, and it's just because all those men and animals had just trampled everything to death. Well,
yeah,
the Confederates had no food coming. They didn't have anything. I mean, they were getting by on a third pound bacon and some hardtack a day. You know what I'm
yeah,
saying? And well, okay, go forage. There's nothing to forage. There's
yeah,
nothing. There's nothing alive around us. There's nothing
yeah.
edible.
Yeah,
And so they literally,
early on, I know they were eating, like you said, the bacon, and I'm trying to remember what else he said. I know they ate a lot of onions. They
yeah,
had a lot of onions, and I can't remember the city. I don't remember if it was Fredericksburg. I don't remember what city, but he talked about them getting there and how beautiful the city was, how beautiful it used to be, and how it had been just flattened to
that's probably Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg
nothing.
prior to that, what George Washington is actually from real close to there.
Yeah.
Fredericksburg was a beautiful town. It was very well to do. And then
Yep.
after after Burnside's attack, it was just, I mean, shelled and destroyed. And
Yeah.
then, of course, the South continued to occupy up into 1860. Well, really, during the whole war, they were kind of around that whole area or whatever. And the advantage the North had was that was one reason why Lee wanted to get it north. Everything was always right there, right?
Yeah.
Well, the North was virtually unscathed. So they had, first of all, their industrial power, they had more guns, they had more of everything, right? They could produce more goods. So there were some times where the North struggled with food, but not bad. They generally had shoes.
Yep.
Their rifles were better. Their cannons were better. They generally had food because everything up there, that was one thing Lee wanted to do. When he went
Yep.
to Gettysburg, he wanted to go live off the land. Now,
Yep.
he tried to say he was giving receipts to, the people there and all that kind of thing, but he wanted to get it out of Virginia in order to, he really, one of his major reasons for going there was to feed his army. That was
Yeah.
a major, major thing was to feed the army to get out of there and go up there where there was more. You know what I'm saying? That's
Yeah.
how sad the Confederates were with all that kind of thing. And you got to understand that. And it was cold some of
Hmm.
those winters, like cold. And guys, no
Yeah.
shoes, like
Yeah.
no, you don't have shoes on. How they even lived like that
I
is
don't know.
crazy. Of course, disease was rampant and all that kind of thing, but I don't know. It's crazy.
It is. There's just I don't know. There's so much to study about it, to learn from it. I mean, you can get so granular in a war like that. Like it's not just looking at one battle. It's like you can dive so deep into one battle that there's just rabbit holes everywhere,
Yep,
just everywhere.
no doubt.
Well, let's wrap this thing up before we go down all the rabbit holes. We got to nerd out for a bit. I guess it's time to maybe think about what, lifting some weights, thinking about Thompson, thinking about softball coming up.
I've got football is doing some speed training here in a few minutes, so I'm going out to do that. Um, they're not lifting today. I gave the softball girls off today just because we're out of school, and I mean
Yeah,
it's October. It's okay for them to have a day off, So I
yeah,
was I was pretty light today.
yeah. Well, impress some of this knowledge upon this generation. They need
I
they need to
try.
learn it.
I try. Actually, the other night, one of our young linebackers, he's in 10th grade, is actually at the Pinson game. I don't even know how we started talking about it. He said he may have heard us talking, and he asked me, Do you know about World War II?" I was like, "Yeah, I know." He said, I'm interested in that." And I said, "Well, do you read books?" And he was like, "You know, my, my 15, 16-year-old boy he ain't reading a book." So
No,
I said, "I tell you what, here's what I'm gonna do. You got to promise me I want you to read this book. You're going to get it and you're going to read it." And I said, "I 100% believe that every American should read this book." And have you ever read E.B. Sledge's book? Uh, uh, uh,
Hmm.
what's,
Hang on,
oh,
I'll tell you in
hang
just a
on.
second.
It's, uh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. I can't
With the
believe
old
it.
breed.
Yeah, with the old breed. So if you've never read that book, first of all, as an Alabamian, you need to read it. E.B. Sledge, after the war, taught at the University of Montevallo until I don't know when he retired from teaching at Montevallo, but he died in 2008-ish or nine, something
This
like
says
that.
2001.
One, okay. So I knew
But yeah,
somewhere in there. So he actually taught at University of Montevallo. I think every American should be required to read that book. So if you
interesting.
haven't read it, you need to read it.
I'll add
Um,
it. I'll add it to the list. It's like every time I talk with like Chris Yeager over at Mountain Brook, I get a new book to read because
yeah.
that's usually what happens. Like
Look,
I think the last one that he suggested that I still haven't gotten to read. So hands up there. But he suggested The Boys in the Boat. So I haven't got to read that one yet. But it's sitting on the shelf over here.
with the old breed detail, E.B. Sledge was in the Pacific and
Yep.
he did all the island hopping. And when I say all the island hopping, I mean he did all the he survived everything. He did all of the island hopping, and it details it, and it is absolutely brutal. And the reason why I say every American should read it is I think every American should be aware of what men have done so you and I can sit here and do this. And
That's
that
it.
book is probably one of the starkest reminders or eye openers as to why that happened. Because he saw and did some just absolute horrendous, horrendous things. Probably the worst being Peleliu. He landed at Peleliu and
Yeah.
it was just absolutely mind-boggling what those men had to go through. Uh,
Yeah. I'm
so
looking over here reading a little bit about it, and yeah, this is going in the Amazon cart today.
it's I now I know a lot of really good books, but that's always one that I start out with people just because of he wrote it. It's a great read. It's really easy to read, but it just you have no idea. Like normal people have no idea what those guys did. And places like Peleliu was the absolute worst thing that a human being could be asked to go through, in my opinion. Peleliu is literally a rock. It's a
Yeah.
rock, and there are thousands of people dead, and it is 100 degrees. You
Mm.
can imagine what that's like.
Yeah.
It
Yeah,
just
like that is a small place.
horrible, horrible. It's a coral rock.
Yeah, like
So
it right
you
it says
literally
it says a census from like 10 years ago says there were like 480 people there.
well, you there's and the Japanese were dug in so well there in caves and all that kind of thing that we literally had to clear caves because even shots from our from ships and all that kind of stuff couldn't collapse because it's just a big rock. So they had to
Wow.
go cave by cave, these little spider holes, and literally just hole by hole clear them out. But then you literally have thousands of people dead, and there's nowhere to bury them. There's nowhere to bury them because it's a rock and it's 110 degrees outside. You can just, I mean, just
Oh,
put yourself in that situation. You know what I'm saying?
man.
Like, just
Yeah,
horrible, horrible,
that's crazy.
horrible, horrible.
I'm gonna order that one today. I've got so many of these that I've got to catch up on. I just, man, you run out of time.
I can give you a bunch.
I need football season to end so I can have my Friday nights back.
I hear you.
I won't wish that away too quick though. Hopefully we'll be covering some teams after Thanksgiving, but we'll see.
We shall see.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you doing this, Brandon. That was fun. It was fun to everybody's gonna tune into this and be like, all right, let me hear about some nutrition and hear about some weights.
Now,
And
I will say
we
this
got to nerd out.
disclaimer. I very, very well could have screwed some things up. Generals they were in charge, the timing of they were when they were because there's probably some Civil War buffs that are better than me that he's going, this guy don't know what he's talking about. Burnside was in charge in March of what look, I may have screwed some of it up. I'm just talking off the top of my head and I'm just a
It's
strong.
hard to do. Hey, it's hard to do, and I'll throw some Civil War resources in the description, and people can go there if they don't want to listen
Okay.
to us ramble on.
There you go.
I appreciate you.
All right, man.
See you
See ya.
later.